I spent most of my life believing prayer was something you did when you were desperate, something you offered upward, hoping it would be received. I believed prayer was asking, pleading, explaining, convincing. I believed it was a transaction between a small, uncertain human and a distant, all-powerful God. And for many years I prayed that way faithfully. I prayed with sincerity. I prayed with emotion. I prayed with fear. I prayed with hope. And yet, despite all my effort, so many of my prayers felt unanswered. They echoed into silence. If you're listening to this right now, it's likely because you've felt that silence too. You've prayed earnestly. You've asked clearly. You've waited patiently. And still, nothing seems to change. You wonder if you're praying the wrong way, if you're missing something. Or worse, if you're unworthy of an answer. Let me tell you something that may feel shocking at first, but will ultimately set you free. Prayer is not asking. Prayer is acknowledging. And the moment you truly understand this, your entire relationship with God, with life, and with yourself will change forever. I know this because I lived on the wrong side of prayer for decades. I studied theology. I studied psychology. I studied the great spiritual traditions of the world. I taught others about faith, belief, and divine law. And yet, I myself was trapped in the most common spiritual misunderstanding of all. I believed prayer was about getting God to do something. The truth is far more beautiful. God is not waiting to be persuaded. God is not withholding blessings until you say the right words. God is not testing your sincerity or measuring your worthiness. God is not separate from you. God is the very life that thinks through you, breathes through you, and experiences the world as you. And prayer, real prayer, is not an attempt to bridge a gap that does not exist. Prayer is the recognition that there was never a gap to begin with. This realization did not come to me gently. It came at a moment of complete inner collapse, a moment when asking no longer worked, a moment when effort was exhausted, a moment when I had nothing left to offer but honesty. It was late one night, many years ago, when I found myself alone in my study, surrounded by books I had read but not yet fully understood, sacred texts, commentaries, philosophical works, all pointing toward truth. Yet none of them were able to give me what I needed in that moment. I was facing a situation in my life that no amount of asking seemed to change. I had prayed every prayer I knew. I had repeated affirmations. I had begged. I had reasoned. I had promised. And still nothing moved. That night, something in me finally gave up. Not faith, but effort. Not belief, but struggle. I stopped asking because I had no energy left to ask. I stopped speaking because words felt empty. And in that stillness, something unexpected happened. I became aware of a presence. Not outside of me, but within. Not dramatic or overwhelming, but calm, intimate, and unmistakably familiar. It wasn't a voice I heard with my ears. It was a knowing that arose from the deepest part of my being. And what I realized in that moment was simple, yet revolutionary. I had been praying as if I were separate from the answer. I had been asking for what already existed. I had been pleading for what was already present. Prayer, I saw, was never meant to be a request sent outward. Prayer was meant to be an acknowledgement of an inner reality. From that night on, everything changed. Not because my circumstances magically transformed overnight, but because my relationship with life itself shifted. I stopped asking God to show up. I started recognizing that God had never left. This is the secret that mystics have whispered for centuries. It is the meaning behind the words, "The kingdom of God is within you." Not poetry, not metaphor, a literal experiential truth. When you pray by asking, you are unconsciously affirming lack. You are declaring that what you desire is absent. You are reinforcing separation. Your subconscious mind, which does not understand theology or language, but responds to feeling and belief, accepts that state as reality and faithfully reproduces it in your experience. But when you pray by acknowledging, you move into alignment. You recognize what already is. You accept what already exists in the divine order. You stop pushing against life and start flowing with it. Let me explain this in a way that makes it practical and real. Imagine sunlight streaming outside your window. If you sit in a dark room and ask the sun to shine, nothing changes. The sun is already shining. Your asking does not make it brighter. What changes the experience is opening the curtains, acknowledging the light, allowing it to enter. Prayer is the opening of the curtain. Most people live their entire lives asking for light, while sitting in darkness they unknowingly maintain. They ask for peace while affirming fear. They ask for abundance while focusing on lack. They ask for healing while identifying with illness. And then they wonder why prayer doesn't work. It works perfectly, just not in the way they think. I once worked with a man who had spent years praying for financial relief. He was sincere, hardworking, and faithful. Every night he prayed, "God, please help me. I don't know how I'm going to make it. Please send me money. Please change my situation." And every night he went to bed anxious, fearful, and tense. When I asked him how he felt after praying, he said, "Still worried, but hopeful." That word hopeful revealed everything. Hope is directed toward the future. Hope implies absence now. I taught him a different approach. I asked him to stop asking entirely. Instead, I asked him to acknowledge. Each morning and night, he would say, quietly, "Thank you for the abundance that is already present in my life. Thank you for the intelligence guiding me. Thank you for the opportunities unfolding now." And most importantly, he was instructed to feel the calm certainty of being supported. At first, it felt strange to him. He said it felt dishonest. I explained that honesty depends on which level of reality you're acknowledging. Circumstances are temporary, truth is eternal. When you acknowledge truth, you are not denying circumstances, you are transcending them. Within weeks, his inner state changed. His anxiety softened. His thinking became clearer. He began noticing ideas and opportunities he had previously overlooked. And naturally, without force or struggle, his outer situation followed. This is not coincidence. It is law. Jesus understood this perfectly when he said, "Whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." He did not say believe that you will receive it. He said believe that you have received it. That is acknowledgement, not asking. Asking places fulfillment in the future. Acknowledgement accepts it in the present. Your subconscious mind lives in the present. It creates from what you accept now, not what you hope for later. When you acknowledge peace, peace becomes your state. When you acknowledge abundance, abundance becomes your awareness. And awareness always precedes manifestation. This is why gratitude is the highest form of prayer. Gratitude does not ask. Gratitude acknowledges. It says, "This is already so." And when gratitude is genuine, when it is felt deeply rather than spoken mechanically, it moves mountains without effort. I once met a woman who had prayed for years for her health to improve. She asked daily, she researched prayers, she tended healing services, and yet her condition remained. When we spoke, I noticed that every prayer she offered was filled with tension. She was praying against her illness rather than acknowledging her wholeness. I taught her a simple shift. Instead of saying, "Please heal me," she began saying, "Thank you for the life that flows through me. Thank you for the intelligence within my body. Thank you for the order that sustains me." At first, nothing dramatic happened, but something subtle did. She stopped fighting her body. She stopped identifying with being broken. She began resting in trust. Over time, her body responded to that inner environment. Healing became natural, not forced. Prayer does not change God. Prayer changes you. And when you change, everything you touch changes with you. This is why prayer is not a performance. It is not about eloquence. It is not about repetition. It is not about volume or emotion. Prayer is consciousness aligning with truth. You do not need to convince God of anything. God already knows. You do not need to remind God of your problems. God is not unaware. What needs to shift is not divine awareness, but human perception. Acknowledgement is the act of seeing reality from God's perspective, rather than from fear. It is seeing yourself as already loved, rather than hoping to be loved. It is seeing yourself as already guided, rather than asking for guidance. When you acknowledge guidance, intuition sharpens. When you acknowledge support, opportunities appear. When you acknowledge peace, chaos loses its grip. Most people live their lives praying from the level of the problem. They speak the language of fear and expect faith to answer. But prayer only works when it is spoken from the level of the solution. To acknowledge is to stand in spiritual authority, not arrogance. Authority. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and where your life flows from. This is why so many prayers feel powerless. They are offered from a place of begging rather than being. They are spoken by someone who feels small to a power they believe is distant. But the truth is this: the power you pray to is the power that prays through you. When you understand this, prayer becomes effortless. You stop asking for signs and start noticing them. You stop asking for answers and start hearing them. You stop asking for help and start cooperating with it. Prayer becomes less about words and more about state, less about effort and more about alignment. There is a stillness beneath your thoughts where truth is always present. When you pray by acknowledging, you enter that stillness. You stop arguing with reality. You stop resisting what is. And in that surrender, life reorganizes itself in ways the mind could never plan. This does not mean you stop acting. It means your actions are no longer driven by fear. They are guided by clarity. True prayer says, "I trust." And trust is the language of miracles. You do not trust because things worked out. Things work out because you trusted. Acknowledgement is trust made conscious. Every time you say, "Thank you," with sincerity, you are declaring faith in action. You are telling your subconscious mind, "This is real." And the subconscious mind does not argue. It obeys. This is why small acknowledgements create large changes. This is why quiet gratitude is more powerful than loud pleading. When you wake in the morning and acknowledge life, instead of asking for it to go well, the day unfolds differently. When you face a challenge and acknowledge intelligence at work, instead of asking for rescue, solutions appear. You are not here to persuade life. You are here to participate in it consciously. Prayer is participation, not petition. Once you understand this, you realize that prayer never goes unanswered. What you experience is the faithful reflection of what you acknowledge as true. If you acknowledge fear, fear answers. If you acknowledge lack, lack answers. If you acknowledge love, love answers. If you acknowledge abundance, abundance answers. Life is always responding. The question is, what are you recognizing? This is not about denying difficulty. It is about refusing to grant it ultimate authority. Circumstances are facts. Truth is greater than facts. Acknowledgement is choosing truth. When you acknowledge who you truly are, the illusion of separation dissolves. You stop living as a seeker and begin living as an expression. You were never meant to spend your life asking for permission to be whole. You were meant to remember that you already are. Prayer, in its purest form, is remembrance. It is the moment you stop saying, "God, where are you?" and start saying, "I am here." And when that shift happens, quietly and gently, life responds. Not because God suddenly hears you, but because you finally heard God. From that place of hearing, prayer ceases to be something you do at certain moments and becomes the way you live. Every thought becomes a silent acknowledgement. Every feeling becomes a prayer. Every reaction becomes a choice between remembering and forgetting who you are. This is why the most powerful prayers are often wordless. They are not spoken, they are embodied. They are the calm confidence you carry into uncertainty. They are the quiet assurance you feel even before evidence appears. They are the inner posture of trust that says, "Without words, I know." When you acknowledge, you no longer chase outcomes, you allow them. You no longer strain to make things happen. You let what already exists move toward you. You stop living from desperation and start living from alignment. This is what it means to pray without ceasing. Not repeating phrases endlessly, but maintaining a state of recognition throughout the day. Recognition that life is intelligent. Recognition that you are guided. Recognition that you are supported even when you cannot yet see how. Most people wait for circumstances to improve before they feel grateful. Acknowledgement reverses that order. You feel grateful first, and circumstances reorganize themselves around that state. This is not blind optimism. It is spiritual intelligence. I have seen this principle work in every area of life, again and again, across decades and countless individuals. Not because the words were perfect, but because the state was aligned. Not because God suddenly decided to intervene, but because the person stopped resisting what was already present. Resistance is subtle. It often hides inside sincere prayer. When you ask from fear, you resist peace. When you ask from lack, you resist abundance. When you ask from self-doubt, you resist wisdom. Acknowledgement dissolves resistance. It says, I stop arguing with what is. I choose to align with what is true. This is why acknowledgement feels calming. The nervous system relaxes because it is no longer bracing for uncertainty. The mind quiets because it no longer feels responsible for controlling outcomes. The heart opens because it no longer feels alone. In acknowledgement, you step out of time. You are no longer waiting. You are being. Waiting is exhausting. Being is restful. This is why true prayer restores energy instead of draining it. When prayer leaves you tired, anxious, or strained, it is not prayer. It is effort disguised as faith. Real prayer leaves you grounded, steady, and quietly confident. You may still face challenges. You may still encounter uncertainty, but you face them from a different place. You face them knowing that intelligence precedes you, that order underlies apparent chaos, that solutions exist before problems appear. This knowing is not intellectual. It is felt, and once felt, it cannot be forgotten, only temporarily overlooked. That is why acknowledgement is not something you master once. It is something you return to again and again. Each time you notice yourself slipping into asking, begging, or fearing, you gently come back to recognition. You do not scold yourself. You do not judge yourself. You simply remember. And remembrance is instantaneous. You can remember in a single breath. You can remember in a single thank you. You can remember in a single moment of stillness. This is why prayer does not require time. It requires presence. When you acknowledge, you stop measuring your life by appearances. You stop asking, is it working yet? You stop checking outcomes constantly. You trust the process because you trust the source, and trust changes how you move. When you trust, you speak differently. You choose differently. You respond instead of react. You notice openings instead of obstacles. You cooperate with life instead of struggling against it. This cooperation is what looks like miracles from the outside, but from the inside, it feels natural, effortless, inevitable. Miracles are not interruptions of law, they are expressions of alignment. When you acknowledge truth, you align with the deepest law of life. And that law always responds. This is why acknowledgement is humility, not arrogance. It is not claiming personal power. It is recognizing impersonal intelligence expressing through you. It is stepping out of ego and into participation. You are not saying, I can do this alone. You are saying, I am not alone. That distinction changes everything. When you acknowledge guidance, you listen more than you speak. When you acknowledge wisdom, you pause before acting. When you acknowledge love, you soften instead of hardening. And life responds to softness far more readily than it responds to force. Force exhausts. Flow sustains. Prayer as asking is forceful, even when gentle in tone. Prayer as acknowledgement is flowing, even when facing difficulty. This is why acknowledgement does not deny pain. It contextualizes it. Pain becomes information, not identity. Difficulty becomes a signal, not a sentence. When you acknowledge truth, you stop defining yourself by what you are experiencing. You define yourself by what you are expressing. You are not a person hoping for peace. You are peace learning how to express itself. You are not a person waiting for abundance. You are abundance discovering new channels. You are not a person seeking love. You are love remembering how to flow. This is not philosophy. This is lived reality once recognition stabilizes. And stabilization happens through gentle consistency, not intensity. Small acknowledgements practiced daily reshape consciousness more profoundly than dramatic prayers offered occasionally. A quiet thank you before sleep does more than hours of anxious pleading. A calm recognition upon waking does more than desperate hope. This is why prayer works best when it becomes simple. Complexity belongs to the mind. Truth belongs to the heart. The heart does not ask. The heart knows. When you let prayer come from the heart, it naturally becomes acknowledgement. You stop saying, please. You start saying, I see. You see support where you once saw absence. You see order where you once saw randomness. You see meaning where you once saw struggle, and seeing is creating. Life follows perception, experience follows awareness, outcomes follow inner states. This is not punishment or reward. It is resonance. You do not get what you ask for. You experience what you resonate with. Acknowledgement changes resonance instantly. This is why it feels like a shift rather than a process. Something clicks, something relaxes, something opens. You realize you have been knocking on a door that was never closed. Prayer was never meant to open God to you. It was meant to open you to God. And God, once recognized, does not need to be summoned again. Presence is continuous. Support is constant. Intelligence is always active. You were never unheard. You were just listening from the wrong place. When you listen from fear, you hear silence. When you listen from trust, you hear guidance everywhere. This guidance may not come as dramatic instruction. Often it comes as clarity, as calm, as a sense of this feels right, as a gentle nudge toward a certain action or a certain pause. Acknowledgement sharpens this inner guidance because it removes noise. Noise comes from asking, clarity comes from recognizing. This is why moments of quiet gratitude often bring insights that hours of thinking cannot. In acknowledgement, the mind steps aside and intelligence takes the lead, and intelligence knows how to arrange details far beyond your personal capacity. You were never meant to carry life alone. Prayer as asking assumes separation. Prayer as acknowledgement dissolves it. Once dissolved, effort becomes unnecessary. You still act, but action is no longer burdened by anxiety. You still plan, but planning is no longer driven by fear. You still care, but caring is no longer entangled with control. This is freedom, not freedom from circumstances, but freedom within them. And freedom within circumstances eventually reshapes circumstances themselves. Because a free consciousness does not reproduce limitation. If you remember only one thing, let it be this: prayer is not how you inform God. Prayer is how you align with God. Alignment is instantaneous. You can align right now. You do not need a ritual. You do not need special words. You do not need to be in a certain place. You only need to shift from asking to acknowledging. Right now, you can acknowledge breath. You can acknowledge awareness. You can acknowledge that life is happening through you effortlessly, and in that acknowledgement, prayer is already complete. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. Nothing needs to be earned. You are already inside the answer. Prayer did not fail you. It was waiting for you to change how you approached it. Stop asking life to prove itself to you. Start acknowledging that life is already supporting you. From that moment forward, everything changes, not because the world becomes different, but because you finally see it as it truly is. And when you see it as it truly is, you stop living in quiet conflict with existence. You stop waking up braced for disappointment. You stop scanning the future for threats. You stop measuring your worth by outcomes. You begin to live from a deeper assurance. An assurance that does not depend on circumstances behaving perfectly. An assurance rooted in something far more stable than conditions. This assurance is what the scriptures call peace that surpasses understanding. It is not the peace that comes after problems are solved. It is the peace that exists before problems dissolve. That peace is not something you ask for. It is something you acknowledge. When you acknowledge peace, you stop fighting reality. You stop arguing with what is happening. You stop telling life how it should unfold. And paradoxically, this is when life begins to unfold more gracefully. Most suffering comes not from what happens, but from the inner resistance to what happens. Asking reinforces that resistance. Acknowledgement releases it. When you say thank you, even quietly, even imperfectly, you step out of resistance. You tell your nervous system it is safe to relax. You tell your mind it does not need to control. You tell your heart it is supported. And from that relaxed state, intelligence flows freely. This is why acknowledgement often brings clarity after confusion, ease after struggle, and resolution after delay. Not because you forced change, but because you stopped blocking it. Life is always moving toward harmony. It is only our fear that interrupts the movement. Prayer, as acknowledgement, removes the interruption. It is important to understand this clearly. Acknowledgement does not mean pretending everything is fine. It means recognizing that something deeper than appearances is always fine. You may feel grief, uncertainty, or loss. Acknowledgement does not deny these experiences. It holds them without letting them define reality. It allows emotion to move without letting fear take over leadership. There is a strength in this that is gentle but unshakable. This strength does not shout. It does not demand. It does not panic. It rests in knowing, and knowing does not need proof. This is why acknowledgement feels quiet. It does not seek validation. It does not need agreement. It simply is. Once you begin to live this way, you notice something subtle but profound. You stop trying to use prayer to change the world and instead allow prayer to change the way you meet the world. And the world responds differently to someone who meets it from wholeness rather than lack. People respond differently. Opportunities arise differently. Challenges resolve differently. Even time feels different. There is less urgency and more flow. You begin to sense that you are not late, that nothing essential has been missed, that life is not punishing you or testing you. You see that everything has been inviting you into deeper recognition all along. Every delay was an invitation to trust. Every challenge was an invitation to remember. Every unanswered prayer was an invitation to shift from asking to acknowledging. And once that shift happens, you realize something extraordinary. You were never waiting for God. God was waiting for you to stop waiting. Waiting implies absence. Acknowledgement reveals presence. Presence is the answer behind every prayer. When you rest in presence, guidance comes without strain. Provision comes without panic. Healing unfolds without force. Relationships soften without manipulation. Life begins to feel cooperative instead of adversarial. This does not mean life becomes perfect. It means you stop needing it to be perfect in order to be at peace. And that peace becomes the foundation from which everything else grows. This is the hidden simplicity of prayer. It was never meant to be complicated. Complexity crept in when fear entered the picture. Fear taught us to ask, to beg, to prove, to perform. Love teaches us to recognize, and recognition is effortless. You recognize beauty without trying. You recognize truth without effort. You recognize love instantly. Prayer works the same way when it returns to its natural form. There is nothing you need to add to yourself to pray correctly. There is nothing you need to remove. You do not need to become more spiritual, more disciplined, or more worthy. You only need to notice what is already here. Notice awareness. Notice breath. Notice the quiet intelligence organizing your thoughts. Notice the life moving through you without your permission. That noticing is prayer, and from that noticing, gratitude arises naturally. Not forced gratitude, not positive thinking, but genuine appreciation for being alive, for being held, for being included in something vast and intelligent. That gratitude changes everything because it aligns you with reality rather than fighting it. Prayer was never meant to be a struggle. It was meant to be a return to trust, a return to simplicity, a return to knowing. The moment you stop asking and start acknowledging, you stop living as someone who is trying to reach God. You begin living as someone who is expressing God, and expression does not strain, it flows. This is why the most powerful prayer you can ever offer is not a sentence, but a state of quiet recognition that says without words, I am held, I am guided, I am not alone. From that state, life responds effortlessly. You do not need to convince the universe. You do not need to explain yourself to God. You do not need to rehearse your worth. You only need to remember. Remember that you are already included. Remember that you are already supported. Remember that you are already part of the answer you have been seeking. Prayer is not asking life to change. Prayer is acknowledging that life is already alive within you, and when that truth settles, not just in your mind, but in your nervous system, in your breath, in your posture toward life, everything becomes lighter. Not because problems vanish instantly, but because you no longer carry them alone. You were never meant to. This is the secret revealed. Not hidden, not mysterious, not reserved for a few. Simply forgotten and now remembered. Prayer is not asking, prayer is acknowledging, and in that acknowledgement, you finally come home. Coming home does not feel dramatic. It feels familiar. It feels like relief. It feels like laying down a weight you didn't realize you were carrying. And once you felt it, even briefly, you begin to recognize how much of life you lived in subtle tension. How often you approached each day braced for disappointment. How frequently you carried the unspoken belief that something was missing, something needed fixing, something had to be earned. Acknowledgement dissolves the tension because it corrects the misunderstanding at its root. It reminds you that life is not withholding itself from you. Life is expressing itself as you. When you see this, prayer stops being something you do in moments of crisis and becomes the way you meet every moment. You acknowledge strength when you feel weak. You acknowledge clarity when you feel confused. You acknowledge love even when circumstances feel unloving. This is not denial. It is alignment. Alignment does not erase difficulty, but it changes your relationship to it. Difficulty no longer feels like a verdict. It feels like a passage, something to move through, not something that defines you. And you move through it differently when you are no longer asking for permission to be supported. You begin to trust yourself more. Not because you suddenly know everything, but because you trust the intelligence that moves through you. You stop second, guessing every decision. You stop waiting for external confirmation before acting. This does not make you reckless. It makes you responsive to intuition, responsive to timing, responsive to the subtle signals life is always offering. Asking prayer drowns out those signals. Acknowledgement amplifies them. When you stop talking at life and start listening with your whole being, guidance becomes unmistakable. It may not shout. It may not arrive as certainty, but it arrives as resonance, as a quiet yes or a gentle no, as a sense of alignment or misalignment. You learn to trust that, and trusting that changes the way you live. You become less reactive, less defensive, less hurried. You no longer feel compelled to prove yourself or justify your path. You begin to move with a kind of inner permission that does not need explanation. This is what it means to walk by faith. Not blind belief, but embodied trust. Trust that you are not operating alone. Trust that life is not random. Trust that even what you do not yet understand is part of a larger intelligence working toward coherence. Prayer, as acknowledgement, strengthens this trust because it removes the illusion that you are separate from what you depend on. You are not asking life to support you. You are acknowledging that life already does. And when you live from that acknowledgement, fear loses its authority. Fear may still arise, but it no longer governs. It becomes a passing signal rather than a command. You can feel fear and still act from trust. You can feel uncertainty and still rest in peace. This is maturity of consciousness. It is not the absence of emotion. It is the absence of identification with fear as truth. Acknowledgement teaches you this gently, patiently over time. Each moment you choose recognition over reaction, you reinforce a new inner pattern. And patterns, once established, begin to operate automatically. Eventually, acknowledgement becomes your default state. You no longer have to remember consciously. You simply live from it. Life feels less like a battle and more like a dialogue. Less like something happening to you and more like something happening through you. And in that dialogue, you realize something quietly profound. You were never meant to beg your way through life. You were meant to recognize your way through it. Recognize intelligence, recognize love, recognize opportunity, recognize yourself. This is why the deepest prayers often sound like statements rather than requests. They sound like truth being spoken into awareness. Not to create it, but to align with it. When you say, I am guided, something in you settles. When you say, I am supported, something in you relaxes. When you say, I am not alone, something in you opens. These are not affirmations meant to convince the mind. They are acknowledgements meant to remind the soul. The soul does not need persuasion. It needs permission to lead. Prayer as acknowledgement gives it that permission, and when the soul leads, life takes on a different rhythm. There is less urgency and more trust, less grasping and more receptivity, less fear of loss and more appreciation of presence. You begin to understand that what you truly wanted from prayer was never control. It was reassurance. It was belonging. It was the sense that you were held by something larger than your own effort. Acknowledgement gives you that directly. It says, you are held now, not later, not if conditions change now. And once you feel held, you stop reaching, you stop straining. You stop exhausting yourself emotionally and spiritually. You rest, and from rest, creativity emerges. From rest, clarity emerges. From rest, right action emerges. This is why the most inspired decisions often come when you stop trying to solve everything. When you pause, when you breathe, when you acknowledge that you do not have to carry the entire weight of life alone. Prayer becomes that pause. Not a pause from life, but a pause into life, into the awareness that something wiser than your personal mind is already at work. You begin to sense that life has a momentum of its own, that there is an order unfolding even when appearances suggest otherwise, that you are included in that order, not excluded from it. This inclusion is what most people are really asking for when they pray. They are asking to feel included, to feel chosen, to feel supported. Acknowledgement answers that immediately. You do not need to wait for circumstances to prove your inclusion. You acknowledge it first, and life reflects it back in ways both subtle and surprising. You may notice doors opening without force, conversations aligning unexpectedly, solutions emerging where none seemed possible. Not because you demanded them, but because you were finally in the state where you could receive them. Reception requires openness. Asking often closes. When you ask from fear, you tighten. When you acknowledge from trust, you open. And openness is the doorway through which everything arrives. This is the paradox. The more you stop asking, the more you receive, not because you deserve more, but because you resist less. Life has always been generous. We simply blocked the flow by insisting it prove itself to us first. Acknowledgement removes that condition. It says, I trust first. And trust is magnetic. It draws experiences that confirm it. It attracts people who resonate with it. It creates circumstances that reflect it, not instantly, not magically, but naturally. This is how prayer reshapes a life, quietly, gently, irreversibly. Once you have lived from acknowledgement, even briefly, asking begins to feel unnecessary. It feels like speaking from a smaller version of yourself. You realize you no longer need to approach life as a stranger knocking on a door. You are already inside. Prayer becomes less about words and more about orientation. An orientation toward trust rather than fear, toward recognition rather than lack, toward presence rather than absence. And that orientation shapes everything. It shapes how you love. It shapes how you work. It shapes how you respond to difficulty. It shapes how you experience joy. Life does not suddenly become perfect, but it becomes coherent, meaningful, supportive in ways you can feel even when you cannot explain them. This is the gift of acknowledgement. It does not promise a life without challenge. It promises a life without abandonment. And that makes all the difference. Because when you know you are not abandoned, you stop living in survival mode. You stop hoarding energy, you stop guarding your heart, you stop assuming the worst, you begin to live generously, openly, courageously. Not because everything is guaranteed, but because you trust the source from which everything flows. Prayer as acknowledgement reconnects you to that source, not somewhere else, not someday, right here, right now. And from that connection, life unfolds not as something you must force, but as something you participate in consciously. This is what prayer was always meant to be. And conscious participation is the difference between existing and living, between enduring life and inhabiting it fully, between feeling like a visitor in your own experience and recognizing that you belong here. When you acknowledge, you stop standing outside your life waiting for permission to enter it. You step in fully, presently, without apology. This is why acknowledgement brings a quiet confidence that cannot be shaken by circumstances. It does not depend on success or approval. It does not collapse when things go wrong. It remains steady because it is rooted in something deeper than outcomes. That depth is what you have been searching for every time you prayed. Not answers, not fixes, but depth, ground. Something solid beneath the shifting surface of experience. Acknowledgement gives you that ground. You realize that even when the outer world feels uncertain, something within you remains unmoved. Something watches, something understands, something holds. This is the witness, the awareness behind thought, the presence that was there before fear, before hope, before language. Prayer reconnects you to that presence, not by summoning it, but by noticing it. And once noticed, it cannot be lost, only ignored. This is why even a single moment of true acknowledgement can sustain you through long periods of uncertainty. Because you are no longer relying solely on circumstances to tell you who you are or whether you are safe. You know from the inside. Knowing from the inside changes how you relate to everything. You stop chasing validation. You stop bargaining with life. You stop fearing that one wrong move will ruin everything. You begin to trust the intelligence that corrects, redirects, and restores without drama. Life becomes less brittle, less fragile. You realize that mistakes do not exile you from grace. Detours do not disqualify you. Delays do not mean denial. All of it becomes part of a larger movement toward coherence. Prayer as acknowledgement allows you to relax into that movement instead of fighting it. This is why gratitude offered in the midst of uncertainty is so powerful. Not because it ignores reality, but because it acknowledges a deeper one. When you say, "Thank you," before understanding, you are declaring trust in the unseen order. And unseen order is still order. You may not yet see how things will resolve, but you acknowledge that resolution exists. You may not yet feel peace, but you acknowledge that peace is available. Acknowledgement creates space for these qualities to emerge naturally. It is not forcing belief. It is choosing orientation. Orientation determines direction. A ship does not need to see its destination to sail correctly. It needs alignment. Prayer as acknowledgement sets that alignment. Once aligned, small course corrections happen automatically. You are nudged away from what no longer serves. You are guided toward what supports growth. Often this guidance feels subtle, a feeling, a hesitation, a sense of ease or unease. You learn to respect these signals because you trust where they come from. Asking prayer often overrides these signals because it is driven by urgency. Acknowledgement sharpens them because it is grounded in presence. Presence slows you down enough to notice what is already happening. And what is already happening is always more intelligent than what the anxious mind imagines. This is why people often say that life began to flow when they stopped trying so hard to control it. They didn't give up responsibility. They gave up resistance. Acknowledgement is the practice of releasing resistance moment by moment. You release resistance when you stop arguing with what is. You release resistance when you stop demanding proof before trust. You release resistance when you stop asking life to justify itself to you. And with resistance gone, energy frees up. Creativity returns. Solutions appear. Not because you earned them, but because you are no longer blocking them. This is the simplicity hidden beneath all spiritual complexity. You do not need to make life happen. Life is happening. You do not need to bring God closer. God is already present. You do not need to become worthy. You already are. Prayer as acknowledgement restores you to this knowing again and again. You may forget. That is human. You may revert to asking. That is habit. But each time you remember, the return is immediate. There is no penalty for forgetting. There is no distance to cross. Recognition collapses time. In a single breath, you can shift from fear to trust. In a single moment of gratitude, you can shift from lack to sufficiency. This is not theory. It is lived reality once practiced gently and consistently. You will notice your language change, not forced but naturally. You will notice your inner dialogue soften. You will notice yourself responding rather than reacting. And others will notice too. They may not know why being around you feels different, but it will. Because acknowledgement changes the atmosphere you bring into a room. When you are not asking for something, you are available. When you are not seeking validation, you are present. When you are not trying to control outcomes, you are trustworthy. Presence is magnetic. People trust those who trust life. Opportunities move toward those who are not grasping. Clarity comes to those who are not frantic. This is not manipulation. It is resonance. Life responds to the quality of consciousness meeting it. Prayer as acknowledgement refines that quality. You begin to meet life with openness instead of defense, with curiosity instead of fear, with gratitude instead of demand, and life meets you there. This meeting is what many call grace. Not something bestowed from above, but something experienced when resistance dissolves. Grace was never absent. It was unrecognized. Acknowledgement is recognition. When you live from recognition, you stop asking why things are happening to you and begin asking how you can participate wisely in what is unfolding. This shift is subtle, but it transforms everything. You no longer see yourself as a passive recipient of fate. You no longer see yourself as a victim of circumstance. You see yourself as a participant in a living, intelligent process. Prayer becomes conversation without words. Guidance becomes felt rather than demanded. Support becomes assumed rather than hoped for. And assumption, in this sense, is not arrogance. It is belonging. You assume support the way a child assumes gravity will hold them, not because they tested it intellectually, but because it has never failed them. Prayer as acknowledgement restores that childlike trust, not naive but grounded. Grounded trust does not collapse when things go wrong. It deepens. When challenges arise, acknowledgement does not panic. It pauses, it remembers, it asks not, why me, but what is being asked of me now? And often, what is being asked is simple: to listen, to rest, to wait, to act gently. Acknowledgement clears enough inner space to hear these answers. This is why prayer does not need to be loud. It needs to be sincere. It does not need to be long. It needs to be real. A single moment of true acknowledgement carries more power than hours of anxious asking, because acknowledgement aligns you with the source from which all answers arise, and alignment is everything. When aligned, you no longer chase meaning. Meaning reveals itself. When aligned, you no longer force healing. Healing unfolds. When aligned, you no longer demand direction. Direction clarifies. This is not magic. It is cooperation with reality. Reality at its deepest level is intelligent, responsive, and supportive. But it can only respond to what you acknowledge as true. If you acknowledge chaos, chaos organizes your experience. If you acknowledge order, order emerges. Life mirrors awareness. Prayer as acknowledgement trains awareness. Over time, you may notice that asking begins to feel unnecessary. You no longer feel the impulse to explain yourself to God. You no longer feel the need to rehearse your fears. You trust that they are already known. You trust that you are already known, and being known is what most people long for beneath all their prayers: to be seen, to be understood, to be held. Acknowledgement gives you that experience internally, and when you feel seen from within, you stop demanding it from the outside. This is freedom. Freedom from the need to prove, freedom from the fear of abandonment, freedom from the endless cycle of asking and waiting. Prayer becomes rest, and from rest, life unfolds as it always has, intelligently, patiently, generously. You simply notice it now, and noticing changes everything. Because what you notice, you nurture. What you nurture, you strengthen, and what you strengthen begins to shape your life from the inside out. When you live in acknowledgement, you stop overlooking the quiet ways life supports you every day. The breath that arrives without effort, the thoughts that organize themselves, the moments of timing that are too precise to be random, the subtle help that shows up just when you need it. You begin to realize that support was never absent. It was simply unacknowledged, and once acknowledged, it multiplies. This is one of the great paradoxes of life. What you recognize grows. What you ignore fades into the background. Prayer as acknowledgement is the art of recognizing the good that is already present, even when it is partially hidden. You do not need perfect conditions to acknowledge truth. You only need willingness. Willingness to pause. Willingness to feel. Willingness to trust something deeper than immediate appearances. This willingness softens the heart. And a softened heart perceives differently. It sees possibility where fear once saw finality. It sees movement where despair once saw stagnation. This is why acknowledgement often feels like hope returning, but deeper than hope. Hope looks forward. Acknowledgement rests now. Hope says, maybe things will change. Acknowledgement says, something is already at work. That distinction matters. When you live from hope alone, you are always waiting. When you live from acknowledgement, you are already participating. Participation brings dignity back into your experience. You no longer feel like a spectator to your own life. You feel engaged, involved, included, and inclusion heals something fundamental in the human spirit. So much pain comes from feeling excluded from love, from meaning, from God, from life itself. Asking prayer often reinforces that feeling. Acknowledgement dissolves it. It says, you are already inside what you are seeking. This understanding does not remove your humanity, it redeems it. You still feel emotion. You still encounter loss. You still navigate uncertainty. But you do so with an inner companion rather than alone. That companion is awareness itself. When you acknowledge awareness, you realize you are not the storm of thoughts and feelings. You are the space in which they move. And that space is vast, calm, and resilient. Prayer reconnects you to that space. Not by effort, but by recognition. Recognition is effortless because it is natural. You recognize a familiar face instantly. You recognize truth instantly. You recognize presence instantly. Prayer works the same way when it returns to simplicity. You stop trying to reach upward and start settling inward. And inward is not small. Inward is infinite. This is why stillness feels expansive rather than empty. Once fear dissolves, it is full, alive, intelligent. Many people avoid stillness because they associate it with absence. In truth, stillness is presence without noise. Acknowledgement invites you into that stillness gently. You do not have to force silence. You simply stop filling the space with asking, and in that space, answers arise naturally. Sometimes as insight, sometimes as timing, sometimes as strength you didn't know you had. These answers do not arrive as rewards. They arrive as expressions of alignment. Alignment is the silent agreement between your awareness and reality. When aligned, you stop feeling pushed or pulled by life. You move with it, and movement with life feels graceful even when it is challenging. This grace is not passive. It is responsive. It meets each moment fully without panic or resistance. Prayer as acknowledgement trains this responsiveness. You begin to meet moments as they are, not as you fear they might be. You respond to what is present instead of what you imagine. This reduces suffering dramatically. Much suffering comes from living in imagined futures or rehearsed pasts. Acknowledgement anchors you in the only place where life actually happens now. Now is where guidance is available. Now is where strength is accessible. Now is where peace exists. Peace does not wait for conditions to improve. Peace exists beneath conditions. Acknowledgement reveals that layer. And once revealed, you realize that peace was never something you had to earn or achieve. It was something you overlooked while trying to manage everything. This realization is deeply humbling, not because it makes you feel small, but because it shows you how little force was ever required. Life was never asking you to struggle your way into alignment. It was asking you to notice what was already true. Prayer, in its original essence, was always this noticing. Over time, you may find that words fall away naturally. Your prayers become quieter, simpler, more spacious. You stop repeating phrases and start resting in awareness. Silence becomes meaningful, not empty silence, but listening silence. In that silence, you may feel guided to act, or you may feel guided to wait. Both are forms of movement when they arise from clarity rather than fear. Asking often pushes you into premature action. Acknowledgement allows timing to reveal itself. Timing is intelligence in motion. When you acknowledge intelligence, you respect timing. You stop forcing outcomes. You stop rushing growth. You trust that what is unfolding knows how to unfold. This trust deepens over time as you witness its accuracy. You look back and realize how often things worked out in ways you could never have planned. How often delays protected you. How often endings opened doors you could not see at the time. Acknowledgement helps you see this not as luck, but as order. Order does not eliminate uncertainty. It gives uncertainty context. You no longer fear not knowing. You trust that not knowing is part of knowing. Prayer as acknowledgement makes room for mystery without anxiety. You stop demanding answers and start allowing understanding to mature. This maturity brings patience. And patience brings peace. Peace is not resignation. It is confidence without control. Control exhausts. Confidence sustains. Acknowledgement builds confidence because it is rooted in relationship rather than outcome. You are no longer relating to life as an adversary or a test. You relate to it as a living intelligence that includes you. Inclusion changes everything. You stop asking, "Why am I here?" and start living from the understanding that your presence itself is meaningful. You stop asking, "Am I doing it right?" and start listening to what feels aligned. You stop asking, "Will I be okay?" and start acknowledging that you already are. This does not make you complacent. It makes you present. Presence is powerful because it is undivided. When you are present, your energy is not scattered between fear and hope. It is available now, and what is available now can be used wisely. Prayer as acknowledgement gathers your energy back to center. This is why it feels like wholeness. You are no longer fragmented, part of you asking, part of you doubting, part of you waiting. You are unified in recognition. Unified awareness is creative. From that creativity, new possibilities emerge. Not because you demanded them, but because you were open enough to receive them. Openness is the posture of acknowledgement. Closed fists cannot receive. Open hands can. Asking often clenches. Acknowledgement opens, and when you open consistently, life responds consistently, not always immediately, not always dramatically, but faithfully. Faithfulness is the nature of life when you stop fighting it. This is the deep assurance acknowledgement brings. That life is not arbitrary. That support is not conditional. That you are not forgotten or overlooked. You are participating in something that has always been moving toward balance. Prayer does not initiate that movement. It allows you to align with it. And alignment feels like ease, not laziness, but effortlessness. Effortlessness does not mean you do nothing. It means you are not internally resisting what you are doing. Resistance creates friction. Alignment creates flow. Prayer as acknowledgement shifts you from friction to flow, and flow carries you further than force ever could. Flow is not something you chase, it is something you allow. And allowance begins the moment you stop insisting that life prove itself to you before you trust it. Most people live with an unspoken condition placed on peace. I'll relax when this is resolved. I'll trust when I see results. I'll feel grateful when things improve. That condition keeps them perpetually tense, perpetually waiting. Acknowledgement removes the condition. It says, "I trust now," and trust now is what opens the door. This is why acknowledgement feels like a softening rather than a surge. There is no rush of adrenaline, no dramatic emotional peak, just a gentle settling into what has always been beneath the noise. You realize that peace was not missing. It was covered. Support was not absent. It was unrecognized. Guidance was not silent. You were listening from fear. Once fear loosens its grip, you begin to hear life differently. You hear it in intuition. You hear it in timing. You hear it in the quiet certainty that arises when something aligns. And when something does not align, you feel that too. Not as panic, but as information. Acknowledgement sharpens discernment because it removes desperation. Desperation clouds judgment. Calm clarifies it. This is why prayer as acknowledgement does not make you passive. It makes you precise. You no longer act out of urgency. You act out of clarity. You no longer say yes from fear. You say yes from resonance. You no longer say no from guilt. You say no from truth. Truth does not need defense. It simply stands. As you live this way, something remarkable happens. You stop trying to manage life and start cooperating with it. You begin to sense when to move and when to pause. When to speak and when to remain silent, when to hold on and when to let go. This cooperation feels natural because it is natural. It is how life was meant to be lived. Struggle entered when we believed we were alone. Ease returns when we remember we are not. Prayer as acknowledgement restores that remembering again and again. It does not promise certainty about outcomes. It offers certainty about belonging. And belonging is what the soul has always wanted. You wanted to know you mattered. You wanted to know you were seen. You wanted to know your life was not an accident. Acknowledgement answers all of that without words. It answers by revealing presence. It answers by restoring connection. It answers by dissolving the illusion of separation. Once separation dissolves, so much effort becomes unnecessary. You stop fighting yourself, you stop resisting emotions, you stop arguing with reality, you allow feelings to move without letting them define you. You allow circumstances to change without assuming they are permanent. You allow yourself to be human without believing that humanity disqualifies you from support. This is compassion turned inward. Compassion is not pity. It is understanding without judgment. And when you extend that understanding to yourself, prayer becomes gentle. Gentle prayer is powerful prayer. It does not shout to be heard. It does not strain to be effective. It does not rush to fix. It rests in trust. Trust does not mean you know how everything will unfold. It means you know you will not be abandoned in the unfolding. That knowing is enough. From it, courage arises. Not reckless courage, but steady courage. The courage to show up honestly. The courage to take the next step without seeing the whole path. The courage to stay open even when outcomes are uncertain. Acknowledgement feeds this courage because it anchors you in something larger than personal success or failure. You are no longer trying to secure your worth through results. You are expressing your worth through presence. Presence is enough. When you show up fully, life meets you fully. Not always how you expect, but always how you need. This is not blind faith. It is relational faith. Faith grounded in experience. You experience support. You experience guidance. You experience coherence. And each experience strengthens trust, which deepens acknowledgement, which further aligns you with life. This is a living cycle. Asking interrupts it. Acknowledgement sustains it. You may still ask questions. Questions are natural. But you no longer ask from fear. You ask from curiosity, and curiosity opens rather than closes. Curiosity says, "What is life showing me here?" Fear says, "Why is this happening to me?" Acknowledgement shifts the question from accusation to inquiry. Inquiry invites insight. Accusation invites resistance. This subtle shift changes the tone of your entire life. You stop feeling like life is something you must survive. You start experiencing it as something you are participating in consciously. Participation brings meaning. Meaning is not assigned from the outside. It arises from engagement. When you engage life from acknowledgement, even ordinary moments carry weight. A conversation matters. A pause matters. A decision matters, not because it must be perfect, but because it is made from presence. Presence sanctifies the ordinary. Prayer, then, is not reserved for sacred moments. It becomes the way you wash dishes, the way you listen, the way you walk into uncertainty. It is the quiet recognition that whatever you are doing, you are not doing it alone. That recognition steadies you. You stop rushing through life to get to a future where you imagine you'll finally feel okay. You begin to feel okay now, even as you move forward. This is not complacency. It is contentment with motion. Contentment does not stop growth. It supports it. Growth fueled by dissatisfaction is frantic. Growth fueled by acknowledgement is organic. Organic growth respects timing. It allows roots to deepen before branches extend. It does not compare itself to others. It unfolds according to its own intelligence. You are no different. Your life unfolds according to an intelligence that knows you intimately. Prayer as acknowledgement reconnects you to that intelligence, not through effort, not through striving, through seeing. Seeing changes everything because it is the beginning of wisdom. Once you see that you are not separate from what you seek, seeking ends. Living begins. You no longer pray to get through life. You pray to be present with it. And presence reveals what was always there. You were never waiting for an answer. You were waiting to recognize it. You were never unworthy. You were simply unaware. You were never abandoned. You were just listening from fear. Now you listen differently. And in that listening, prayer becomes what it was always meant to be, not a request sent into silence, but a recognition of a relationship that has never been broken. That recognition settles gently, quietly, unmistakably. And once it settles, you live differently, not perfectly, not without challenge, but with trust, with steadiness, with a deep, unshakable sense that life is not against you. It never was. And when you truly know that life is not against you, a great weight lifts. You stop interpreting every challenge as a verdict. You stop reading every delay as rejection. You stop assuming that silence means absence. You begin to see challenges differently, not as obstacles placed in your way, but as invitations to deepen trust. Not as signs of failure, but as opportunities to practice remembrance. This does not mean you enjoy every difficulty. It means you are no longer undone by them. There is a quiet resilience that grows when you live from acknowledgement. A resilience that does not harden you, but softens you. A strength that does not isolate you, but connects you more deeply to life. You stop asking, "Why is this happening?" and begin asking, "How can I meet this wisely?" Wisdom arises naturally when fear loosens its grip. Fear narrows perception, trust widens it. Prayer as acknowledgement widens perception. It allows you to see options where you once saw walls. It allows you to notice help where you once saw abandonment. This widening does not happen all at once. It happens moment by moment, breath by breath, recognition by recognition. Each time you choose acknowledgement over anxiety, you strengthen a new inner pathway, and pathways, once strengthened, become the way you naturally move through life. Eventually you realize something quietly profound. You are no longer trying to get life right. You are living it honestly. Honesty with yourself replaces performance. Presence replaces pressure. Trust replaces tension. And when trust becomes your default, life responds with remarkable coherence. Not perfection, but coherence. Things begin to make sense. Even when they are difficult, you look back and see patterns where you once saw chaos. You see learning where you once saw loss. You see guidance where you once saw confusion. Acknowledgement does not erase the past. It redeems it. You begin to understand that nothing was wasted. Not the waiting. Not the struggle. Not the unanswered prayers. Each moment was shaping your capacity to recognize. Asking taught you what did not work. Silence taught you where to listen. And now recognition teaches you how to live. This is why prayer as acknowledgement feels like maturity rather than excitement. It does not intoxicate. It stabilizes. You no longer need constant reassurance. You carry reassurance within you. You no longer need signs to prove you are supported. You trust the support itself. This trust does not make you careless. It makes you careful in the right way. Careful with your attention. Careful with your energy. Careful with what you acknowledge as true, because you now understand that what you acknowledge shapes your experience. You become more selective, not from fear but from wisdom. You choose where to place your attention. You choose which inner states you cultivate. You choose what you reinforce. Prayer becomes the quiet art of choosing recognition over reaction. And reaction loses its power when recognition is present. You still feel emotions, but you do not drown in them. You still face uncertainty, but you do not collapse into it. You remain grounded. Groundedness is not rigidity, it is flexibility rooted in trust. A tree bends in the wind because its roots are deep. A life bends without breaking when acknowledgement has taken root. This is the fruit of prayer understood correctly, not answers shouted from the sky, not miracles demanded on command, but a life that feels held, guided, and meaningful from the inside out. And from that life, outcomes naturally change. Not because you forced them to, but because you are no longer working against the intelligence that produces them. You cooperate. You listen. You respond. This cooperation is what many call grace. Grace is not a reward for good behavior. It is the natural state of alignment. When you align through acknowledgement, grace flows without effort. This flow may look like healing. It may look like opportunity. It may look like peace in the midst of uncertainty. All of these are expressions of the same thing, recognition of what has always been present. Prayer never failed you. It was only misunderstood. You were never meant to beg your way into peace. You were never meant to earn your worth. You were never meant to convince God of anything. You were meant to remember. Remember that you are already included. Remember that you are already guided. Remember that you are already supported by something wiser than fear. Prayer is not asking. Prayer is acknowledging. Acknowledging presence. Acknowledging intelligence. Acknowledging love. And when you acknowledge love, you begin to live from it. You treat yourself differently. You treat others differently. You treat life differently. Love stops being something you seek and becomes something you express. This expression changes your world quietly, steadily, inevitably. You no longer wait for life to give you permission to be at peace. You claim peace by recognizing it. You no longer wait for certainty to act. You act from trust and let certainty follow. You no longer wait to feel worthy. You live as though you already are, because you are. This is the secret revealed, not hidden in complexity, but revealed in simplicity. Prayer is not asking for what you lack. Prayer is acknowledging what you are part of, and you are part of something vast, intelligent, and deeply supportive. You always have been. The moment you stop asking and start acknowledging, you stop standing outside your life. You step fully into it, and life, recognizing itself in you, responds. It responds not with spectacle, but with steadiness, not with noise, but with clarity, not with constant reassurance, but with an unshakable sense of rightness that begins to guide your steps from within. You start to notice that life no longer needs to shout to get your attention. You are listening now. You are receptive. You are present. Presence is the doorway through which everything meaningful enters. When you live from presence, prayer is no longer something you fit into your day. It becomes the undercurrent of your day. It is the way you breathe through uncertainty, the way you pause before reacting, the way you trust when you cannot yet see. You stop asking life to change so you can be at peace. You allow peace to change how you experience life, and that changes everything. Because peace is not passive, peace is powerful. It is the soil in which wisdom grows. It is the ground from which right action arises. It is the atmosphere in which healing, clarity, and creativity occur naturally. When peace becomes your starting point instead of your reward, life reorganizes itself around that state. This is not something you force. It happens quietly, almost invisibly, as you stop interfering. You interfere less because you trust more. You trust more because you acknowledge what has always been true. That acknowledgement becomes your anchor. When fear arises, you return to it. When doubt whispers, you return to it. When circumstances feel heavy, you return to it. You return not to words but to knowing. Knowing that you are not separate. Knowing that you are not forgotten. Knowing that you are not navigating life alone. This knowing does not eliminate questions, but it removes despair. It does not guarantee outcomes, but it guarantees presence. And presence is enough to meet anything that arises. Eventually, you stop needing reminders. The truth settles into you. It becomes the way you stand, the way you speak, the way you move through the world. Others may sense it before you do. A calmness, a steadiness, a grounded quality that does not depend on circumstances. That is acknowledgement embodied. You are no longer praying for life to meet you. You are meeting life consciously, and life meets you back, not because you demanded it, not because you earned it, but because you finally recognized that you were always part of the conversation. Prayer was never a message sent outward. It was always a recognition spoken inward. And once spoken, even silently, it echoes through every part of your experience. You live differently. You choose differently. You trust differently. Not because you became someone new, but because you stopped forgetting who you already were. Prayer is not asking. Prayer is acknowledging. Acknowledging that life is intelligent. Acknowledging that you are included. Acknowledging that what you seek is already closer than breath. This is not something to believe. It is something to notice. And the moment you notice it, prayer is complete. And once prayer is complete, life continues. But now you continue with it consciously. You walk forward not as someone hoping to be heard, but as someone who knows they are already in relationship. You move through your days with a quiet confidence that does not need to announce itself. You begin to live from a deeper yes. Yes to presence. Yes to trust. Yes to the intelligence that has been guiding you long before you knew how to listen. This yes does not make life effortless, but it makes it meaningful. It gives context to effort. It gives purpose to waiting. It gives depth to ordinary moments. You stop measuring your life by outcomes alone and begin to measure it by alignment. Alignment feels right even when it is hard. Misalignment feels wrong even when it looks successful. Acknowledgement sharpens this awareness. You learn to honor what feels true rather than what merely looks impressive. You learn to respect your inner knowing rather than override it with fear or expectation. This is spiritual adulthood. You are no longer trying to be rescued. You are no longer trying to prove yourself. You are no longer trying to bargain with life. You are participating. Participation brings dignity. Dignity brings peace. And peace becomes the foundation from which everything else grows. This is why prayer, understood as acknowledgement, transforms not just moments but lives. It restores wholeness. It restores trust. It restores the sense that you belong here, and belonging changes how you treat yourself. You stop being harsh with your mistakes. You stop rushing your healing. You stop punishing yourself for being human. You allow growth to unfold naturally. Natural growth is steady. It does not collapse under pressure. It does not need constant validation. It knows where it is going because it is rooted. You are rooted now, rooted in awareness, rooted in presence, rooted in the quiet knowing that you are not separate from the source of life itself. This knowing becomes your prayer, not spoken once, but lived daily, not practiced occasionally, but embodied gently, not performed, but remembered. And as you remember, you help others remember too. Your calm becomes permission. Your presence becomes reassurance. Your way of being becomes an invitation. You no longer need to convince anyone of truth. You simply live it. This is how prayer changes the world. One grounded, aware, acknowledging life at a time. Prayer is not asking, prayer is acknowledging. And acknowledgement is the moment you stop standing outside your life and step fully into it. You were never late. You were never lacking. You were never unheard. You were always included. Now you know. And knowing changes the way you carry yourself through the world. You move with less urgency but more purpose. Less noise but more depth. You stop chasing signs because you have learned to recognize presence. You stop searching for approval because you feel anchored in belonging. Belonging is the quiet confidence that nothing essential is missing. From that place, even your desires change. They become clearer, simpler, more aligned. You no longer want things to fill a void. You want things to express what is already alive within you. Desire becomes expression instead of compensation. This is when life begins to feel honest. You do not pretend everything is fine. You do not deny pain or uncertainty, but you no longer dramatize them into identity. You allow experiences to pass through without defining you. You remember who you are while you feel what you feel. That remembering is prayer in motion. You remember while you work. You remember while you rest. You remember while you grieve. You remember while you celebrate. Nothing is excluded. And because nothing is excluded, nothing needs to be forced. Force was always a sign of forgetting. Ease is the sign of recognition. Ease does not mean the absence of effort. It means effort without inner conflict. You do what needs to be done without fighting yourself along the way. This is freedom, not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from resistance. Resistance drains life. Acknowledgement restores it. You begin to feel life flowing through you rather than happening to you. Your actions feel less like pushing and more like responding. Your decisions feel less like guessing and more like listening. Listening becomes your superpower, not listening for instructions shouted from outside, but listening to the quiet coherence within. That coherence was always there. It was simply drowned out by fear, urgency, and endless asking. Now the noise has softened. In that softness you realize something beautiful. You never needed to become worthy. You never needed to earn love. You never needed to persuade God, life, or existence of your value. Your existence was the proof. Prayer did not grant you that truth. It revealed it, and once revealed, it cannot be unseen. You may forget temporarily. You may slip back into old habits. But something fundamental has shifted. You know where to return. You return to acknowledgement. You return to presence. You return to the quiet truth that you are already held. This return does not require effort. It requires honesty. The honesty to admit when you are afraid. The honesty to pause instead of panic. The honesty to stop asking for reassurance and start resting in awareness. That honesty is sacred. From it, life opens, not dramatically, not all at once, but faithfully, moment by moment, step by step, recognition by recognition. Prayer is not asking. Prayer is acknowledging. And acknowledgement is the doorway back to yourself. And when you return to yourself, you return to life. Not as a stranger, not as an outsider, but as a participant who finally remembers where they belong. You stop living as though you must earn your place in the world. You stop negotiating for peace. You stop waiting for permission to rest, to trust, to be whole. You allow yourself to stand where you already are, and standing there, fully present, you realize something that quietly changes everything. Nothing essential is missing. There may be growth ahead. There may be healing unfolding. There may be lessons still forming. But lack is no longer the story. The story becomes awareness. The story becomes relationship. The story becomes participation in something that has never excluded you. This is why acknowledgement is so powerful. It does not promise escape from life. It promises intimacy with it. You are no longer trying to get through life so you can finally live. You are living now, in the midst of becoming. That is prayer fulfilled. Not because circumstances have resolved, but because separation has dissolved. And from this place, even asking takes on a different tone. It is no longer desperate or fearful. It is conversational, curious, grounded. You may still speak desires, you may still express needs, but they arise from trust, not from emptiness. They arise from fullness, recognizing movement. This is the difference. Prayer is not asking from lack. Prayer is acknowledging from wholeness, and wholeness does not deny growth. It supports it. As you move forward, remember this gently. When life feels uncertain, pause. When fear arises, soften. When the urge to beg or bargain appears, notice it without judgment. Then return. Return to presence. Return to awareness. Return to the quiet recognition that you are already held. You do not need to shout to be heard. You do not need to strive to be seen. You do not need to prove your worth. You are already in relationship with the very source of life itself. Prayer is simply remembering that relationship, and once remembered, it guides you. Once remembered, it steadies you. Once remembered, it carries you. You walk forward differently now, not because the world changed overnight, but because you did. You no longer stand outside your life asking to be let in. You stand within it, aware, receptive, alive. Prayer is not asking. Prayer is acknowledging. An acknowledgement is the moment you finally realize you were never separate to begin with. And that realization settles not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. A beginning without urgency, a beginning without pressure, a beginning rooted in quiet confidence. You begin each day a little less rushed to define yourself, a little less compelled to prove something, a little more willing to meet life as it is. You stop waking up asking, "What do I need to fix today?" and start waking up acknowledging, "I am already here." That simple shift changes how the day unfolds. You listen more carefully. You react less automatically. You respond more intentionally. You notice when your body tenses and you soften instead of pushing. You notice when fear tries to take the wheel and you gently return to presence. You notice when your mind starts telling old stories and you choose not to argue with them, only to step back and see. Seeing breaks the spell. You are no longer trapped inside every thought you think. You are the one who notices them, and the one who notices is always free. That freedom is not dramatic, it is subtle, but it is real. It feels like space inside your chest, like breath moving without resistance. Like knowing you don't have to solve everything right now. This is the lived experience of acknowledgement. Prayer stops being something you do when things go wrong. It becomes how you stay aligned when things are ordinary. And it is in the ordinary that life is actually lived. You bring acknowledgement into conversations, into decisions, into uncertainty. You acknowledge before you react. You acknowledge before you judge. You acknowledge before you rush ahead. And in that pause, wisdom has room to surface. Wisdom does not shout. It emerges when you stop drowning it out. You may find that you speak less but mean more, that you choose fewer words, but truer ones, That silence no longer feels awkward, but rich, rich with presence, rich with listening, rich with awareness. This is not withdrawal from life. It is intimacy with it. You are no longer trying to control outcomes. You are cooperating with unfolding. You are no longer resisting uncertainty. You are learning to walk with it. Uncertainty loses its edge when you are rooted. Rootedness is not knowing what will happen. It is knowing you will meet what happens with clarity. Prayer as acknowledgement builds that clarity. It trains you to recognize when you are moving from fear and when you are moving from trust. It teaches you to feel the difference. And once you feel the difference, you cannot ignore it. Fear feels tight. Trust feels open. Acknowledgement always leads you back to openness. And openness allows life to move through you rather than against you. This does not mean life becomes predictable. It becomes meaningful. You begin to sense that even the detours carry intelligence. Even the pauses have purpose. Even the endings are not mistakes. Nothing needs to be wasted when you are present. Presence redeems experience. You stop labeling parts of your life as failures and others as successes. You begin to see everything as feedback, as information, as movement. Movement toward awareness, movement toward alignment, movement toward remembering. Remembering does not happen once. It happens again and again. Each time you pause instead of panic. Each time you acknowledge instead of ask. Each time you trust instead of force. This is the practice. Not a ritual, not a formula, a way of being. Prayer is not asking. Prayer is acknowledging. Acknowledging that you are already part of the answer. Acknowledging that guidance is already present. Acknowledging that the life you are seeking to reach has always been reaching you. And when you live from that knowing, you stop searching for signs that you are supported. You start recognizing support in how you move, how you decide, how you feel grounded even when things are unclear. That groundedness is not something you manufacture. It is what remains when you stop trying to hold everything together by force. You let life hold you, and life does, quietly, faithfully, moment by moment. This is not the end of the journey. It is the end of striving. From here, you walk forward with awareness instead of anxiety, with trust instead of tension, with acknowledgement instead of asking. And that makes all the difference. And so this is where it all comes together. Not as a dramatic finale, but as a quiet return. A return to what was always true. You do not leave this understanding and go back to life. You bring it with you into life, into your mornings, into your conversations, into your work, into your waiting, into your healing. You begin to live as someone who knows they are already in relationship with existence itself, and that knowing changes the tone of everything. You stop asking life to prove its goodness. You stop asking God to show up. You stop asking yourself if you are enough, because acknowledgement has already answered those questions. You are here. You are included. You are held. Prayer was never meant to be a transaction. It was never meant to be a performance. It was never meant to be an appeal from a distance. Prayer was always meant to be communion, a quiet recognition, a settled awareness, a lived understanding that you are not separate from the source you seek. When you acknowledge this, you stop knocking on a door that was never closed. You realize you were already inside life, inside meaning, inside guidance. This is the great shift, not from failure to success, not from lack to abundance, but from separation to belonging. And belonging is what heals the deepest fear of all, the fear that you are alone. You are not. You never were. Prayer is not asking. Prayer is acknowledging presence in every breath, acknowledging intelligence in every unfolding, acknowledging love in every moment you allow yourself to be still enough to feel it. Let this be what you carry forward. Not as an idea to remember, but as a way to live. When you feel lost, acknowledge. When you feel afraid, acknowledge. When you feel uncertain, acknowledge. Return to presence. Return to awareness. Return to the quiet truth that you are already part of what you are seeking. This is not something you must practice perfectly. It is something you will remember again and again, and each time you remember, life meets you there, not with answers shouted from the sky, but with clarity that rises from within. This is the secret revealed. This is the prayer that works. This is the understanding that changes everything. You were never unheard. You were never unworthy. You were never outside the circle. You were always included. Now you know.